Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. It was the summer of 2004 in the UK. One of those stretches where the days feel too long and the heat seems to sit heavy in the air, refusing to move. A group of us were working evenings in a small town, the kind of place that feels quiet during the day and slightly off once the sun goes down. We were booked into an old hotel, the sort of building that had clearly been standing for a long time, with thick walls, narrow hallways, and a feeling that it carried more history than it ever let on. I had just flown in that day, and I was exhausted in the deep, dull way that only travel fatigue can give you. My body felt heavy, my head foggy, and all I wanted was a few hours of sleep before work that evening. Our crew chief had checked everyone in ahead of time, so when I arrived, I didn't have to deal with the front desk. He handed me my key, gave me a quick nod, and I headed straight for my room, without really taking anything in. The room itself was basic and dated. Old furniture, slightly worn carpet, and a bed that looked like it had seen decades of use. There was no air conditioning, which I immediately noticed because the heat was brutal. I opened the curtains wide and cracked the window to let in whatever air I could, hoping it would help. Outside, the afternoon light poured in, bright and warm, making the room feel stuffy and uncomfortable. I lay down anyway, telling myself that tiredness would win eventually. It didn't. I was restless, sweaty, and irritated. I kept shifting on the bed, trying to find a position that felt even remotely comfortable. My mind wouldn't slow down, and every small sound seemed louder than it should have been. The building creaked in that normal way old places do, but something about the atmosphere felt off, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. I remember staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, waiting to drift off. That's when I noticed a strange sound. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't something I could immediately identify. It was more like a low, unnatural noise. Subtle but wrong, as if it didn't belong in the room at all. At the same time, I became aware that the temperature had changed. Just moments earlier, I had been uncomfortably hot, but suddenly the air felt cooler, almost cold, like someone had opened a door to winter. That moment is burned into my memory with unsettling clarity. I was lying on my left side, facing the wall. Curious and uneasy, I decided to roll onto my back to see if I could figure out where the sound was coming from or why the air felt different. My eyes were open as I shifted my weight and turned. The instant I rolled onto my back, everything changed. Out of nowhere, it felt like something incredibly heavy slammed down onto my chest and body. I was pinned to the bed with a force that felt overwhelming, far stronger than anything human. The pressure was crushing, absolute, as if an enormous weight had been dropped directly on top of me. The bed itself groaned under the strain, the frame creaking loudly, which only made the terror spike even higher. I couldn't move. I couldn't lift my arms, couldn't turn my head, couldn't even draw in a proper breath. Panic exploded through me, raw and immediate. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattering, and every instinct in my body was screaming that something was horribly wrong. I tried to shout, to call out, but no sound came. It felt like my voice was trapped inside my chest. Time stopped making sense. I have no idea how long it lasted. It could have been seconds or minutes, but in that moment, it felt endless. My mind raced through explanations, trying desperately to latch onto something logical. Was I having a medical emergency? A stroke? I'd had blood clots before, and that thought cut through the fear like a knife. Maybe this was my body failing me. Maybe I was dying in this strange, overheated room. But the sensation didn't feel internal. It felt external, deliberate, like something was actively holding me down. The pressure didn't just restrain me, it dominated me. The weight was so real that I could hear the bed reacting to it. Every muscle in my body strained uselessly against an unseen force that refused to budge. The air felt thick, heavy, oppressive. I remember staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, completely awake, completely aware. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the strange sound returned. The pressure lifted. The temperature shifted back to what it had been before. Warm and stagnant. In an instant, I was free. I could move again. I sucked in a sharp breath, my lungs burning as if I'd been underwater. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't stop to think. I jumped out of the bed, hands shaking, adrenaline surging through me. I grabbed my clothes and pulled them on as fast as I could, barely caring what I looked like. Whatever had just happened, I wanted out of that room immediately. I wasn't curious. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I left the room and slammed the door behind me. In the hallway, I started pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down. My thoughts were spiraling, flipping between denial and fear. I kept telling myself it was impossible, that it wasn't real, that there had to be a rational explanation. Sleep paralysis crossed my mind, but I dismissed it almost instantly. I hadn't been asleep. I wasn't drifting off. I had been wide awake, eyes open, fully conscious. The medical angle came back hard. Maybe I'd had a mini-stroke. Maybe a clot had caused some kind of temporary paralysis or hallucination. The idea terrified me, but it was still somehow more comforting than the alternative. I stood there, trying to assess my body, checking if I could move everything properly, if my speech felt normal. I didn't want to overreact, but I also didn't want to ignore something serious. Before calling an ambulance, I decided to check one more thing. I went down to the front desk. I didn't tell them what had happened. I didn't tell them which room I was in. I was careful, almost cautious to a fault, because the last thing I wanted was to give them an opening to mess with me. Instead, I asked casually if there had ever been reports of strange experiences in the hotel, weird noises, unusual things, anything out of the ordinary. The reaction was immediate. The staff didn't laugh. They didn't brush it off. Instead, they exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. One of them reached behind the desk and pulled out a book, worn and thick, its pages clearly well used. It was a logbook. They explained, almost too casually, that guests had been reporting strange experiences for years. The hotel had a reputation. People claimed it was haunted. The logbook was a record of those reports written by guests who had experienced things they couldn't explain. I felt my blood drain from my face. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked if there were any specific rooms where these things happened more often. I still hadn't told them my room number. I didn't want to influence the answer in any way. Without hesitation, they named my room. They also named the room directly across the hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach. I asked what kinds of things people had reported in my room. The answer made my skin crawl. Guests had written about feeling like they were being pinned to the bed. Others claimed they'd been punched while in the bathroom. The descriptions were disturbingly specific. They showed me the logbook. There it was in writing. Multiple entries, different people, different dates, same experiences. I felt sick. There was no denying it anymore. What had happened to me wasn't unique. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone in experiencing it. The logic I'd been clinging to started to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping fear that settled deep in my chest. I went back upstairs, but there was no chance I was sleeping alone in that room again. That night, 7 grown men shared a single room. No jokes, no complaints. No one wanted to be by themselves. Another guy on the crew had seen strange things in that same hallway, which only added to the tension. The mood was heavy, anxious, and silent in a way I had never experienced before. I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to every sound, every breath, every shift of fabric. My mind replayed the experience over and over again, trying to find some flaw in it, some detail that would make it less real. But nothing changed. The memory stayed sharp, vivid, undeniable. I have never been so terrified in my life. What made it worse was the certainty. I knew I hadn't been asleep. I knew it wasn't sleep paralysis. I knew my mind hadn't tricked me. I had been awake, aware and conscious the entire time. Whatever happened in that room happened to me while I was fully present. I've never experienced anything like it since. No strange sounds, no crushing weight, no unseen force. That single incident stands alone, untouched by anything, before or after. And maybe that's what makes it even more unsettling. I can't dismiss it as a pattern or a condition. It was one moment, one room, one experience that shattered my sense of what was possible. Even now, years later, I can still feel it if I think about it too long. The weight, the fear, the helplessness, the way reality seemed to bend just enough to let something impossible slip through. I don't pretend to understand it. I don't even try to explain it anymore. All I know is that whatever happened in that old hotel room was real enough to change me, and no amount of logic has ever fully erased the memory of being held down by something I couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. I was around 4 years old when this happened, so most of what I remember comes in fragments. The memories don't play out like a clear movie in my head. Instead, they feel more like flashes of emotion, colors, sounds, and sensations that never really faded, even if I didn't fully understand them at the time. What I do know for sure is that it was an ordinary day that could have ended in a way that would have erased everything that came after. We lived near a park, the kind of neighborhood park where parents felt comfortable letting their kids run around freely. It wasn't hidden or isolated. It was open, green, and usually full of people. Families, kids on bikes, people walking their dogs. To a child, it felt safe. To adults, it looked safe. That sense of safety is probably the most unsettling part when I look back on it now. That day, I was outside playing with a group of other kids. I don't remember exactly what we were doing. Probably running around, making up games, the kind of pointless but joyful play that fills time when you're that young. I remember laughter, movement, and the feeling that the world was simple. I didn't have worries. I didn't think about danger. I didn't even really think about my parents unless I needed something. At some point, without meaning to, I wandered away from the group. I didn't run off dramatically or sneak away. I just drifted. One moment I was with the other kids, and the next I was walking on my own. The area I wandered into wasn't empty. People were still around. There were still voices in the distance, footsteps, the low hum of activity. That's important because it meant nothing felt wrong to me. I wasn't scared. I wasn't lost. I was just exploring the way kids do when curiosity pulls them a few steps farther than it should. I was minding my own business when the couple approached me. I don't remember what they looked like clearly. I don't remember their faces in detail, which somehow makes it worse. They weren't scary. They didn't look angry or strange. If anything, they looked normal, safe, the kind of adults you wouldn't think twice about. That's probably why everything that followed worked so easily. They spoke to me gently, calmly. They smiled. They told me they were my aunt and uncle. They said they had come from a different city to visit. At 4 years old, I didn't really understand what an aunt or uncle was supposed to look like. I didn't question why I didn't recognize them. I didn't think to ask why I'd never met them before. Adults said things, and I believed them. That was how my world worked. Then they handed me a lollipop. I remember that part clearly because it mattered to me at the time. A lollipop was a good thing, a reward, a treat, something nice. I didn't think of it as a bribe. I didn't think of it as suspicious. I just took it. I probably said thank you. I probably smiled. Looking back now, it makes my stomach turn, but at the time, it felt normal. After that, they told me my parents had sent them. They said it was getting dark and that my mom and dad wanted me to come home. They said their kids were already at my house and were waiting to play with me. That part excited me. The idea of other kids waiting for me, ready to play, sounded great. Everything they said was carefully shaped to fit into my small understanding of the world, and I believed them. I followed them. Even now, as an adult, that realization sends a cold wave through me. I followed them willingly, without fear, without hesitation. I didn't cry. I didn't resist. I didn't think anything was wrong. That's how close it was. That's how easy it would have been for me to disappear. We walked toward their van. The park was still fairly crowded. People were around. Adults passed by. No one stopped us. No one asked questions. No one looked twice at a small child walking with two adults toward a vehicle. It probably looked ordinary. It probably looked like a family leaving the park after a long day. I was right there, in plain sight. As we got closer to the van, I remember feeling a little unsure, but not enough to stop. I didn't know why. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar vehicle. Maybe it was the way the door looked when it opened. I don't remember clearly. What I do remember is that I was about to step inside, and then everything exploded. Suddenly my mom came running toward us. I didn't see her approach from far away. One moment everything was quiet and controlled, and the next moment there was screaming. Real screaming. The kind that doesn't sound human at first. The kind that cuts through everything else. My mom was screaming at the top of her lungs. My dad was right behind her, running as fast as he could. I had never seen my mom like that before. Her face was pure panic, pure terror. To a 4-year-old, that was more frightening than anything else that day. I didn't understand what was happening, but I understood that something was very, very wrong. I started crying instantly, not just crying, but full-on sobbing. I panicked. My body reacted before my mind could. I dropped down and curled into a ball right there in front of the van. I was overwhelmed, confused, and scared by my mom's screams. I didn't know who to listen to anymore. The adults who had been calm and kind were suddenly surrounded by chaos, and my sense of safety shattered. After that point, my own memory fades. I remember crying. I remember the ground. I remember noise and movement around me. But the details blur. My brain, small and overloaded, couldn't process everything. What I know about what happened next comes from my parents. My mom told me that she ran straight to me and grabbed me, pulling my small, shaking body into her arms. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She just reacted. My dad, on the other hand, went straight for the man. All the fear and rage and desperation that had been building inside him exploded at once. He started swinging. He didn't stop to talk. He didn't stop to ask questions. He was devastated and furious, and he did what any parent would do in that moment. He fought. While my dad was confronting them, my mom called 911. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone, but she managed to tell them what was happening. By some miracle of timing, the police station was only about 6 blocks away. They arrived quickly. The couple was arrested right there. I didn't see them taken away. I was too busy clinging to my mom, crying until my chest hurt, until my throat burned. The world had gone from safe to terrifying in seconds, and I didn't understand why. For a long time after that, I didn't know the full story. My parents didn't tell me everything right away. They protected me as much as they could. They explained that I had almost been taken by strangers, but they didn't go into details. I was too young to understand what that really meant anyway. I just knew that something bad had almost happened, and that my parents had saved me. It wasn't until about 10 years later that they told me the whole truth. By then, I was old enough to understand what they were saying, old enough for the words to sink in, old enough for the reality to hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents told me that after the arrest, they found out the couple had kidnapped 2 other children from somewhere else in the U.S. They hadn't just taken them, they had sold them to private billionaires. That sentence alone changed everything. As a child, I hadn't understood what danger really meant. As a teenager, I suddenly understood far too much. The idea that I could have been sold like an object, handed over to powerful people who could do whatever they wanted, made my stomach twist in a way I still remember clearly. For about a week after my parents told me everything, I was a mess. I was distraught. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed the story over and over in my head, imagining different outcomes, imagining what would have happened if my mom had been a minute later, if my dad had been distracted, if they hadn't noticed me wandering off when they did. I thought about the other kids. I thought about what might have happened to them. The fear, the confusion, the pain, the fact that they didn't get saved the way I did. That knowledge sat heavy in my chest and refused to leave. As time passed, the sharp edge of the fear dulled. I grew up. I moved on. I built a life. On the surface, I'm not deeply affected by the event anymore. I don't have nightmares every night. I don't panic when I see vans. I don't live in constant fear. But the thought never truly goes away. Every once in a while, it comes back without warning. A chill up my spine, a sudden tightness in my chest, the realization of how close I came to something unimaginably horrible. The fact that I could have been sold off to older men who could have raped me, beaten me, or killed me is something my mind still struggles to fully grasp. It's not dramatic, it's not exaggerated, it's just the truth, and that truth is ugly. What scares me the most isn't just what almost happened. It's how normal it all looked. A crowded park, a smiling couple, a lollipop, a van, no alarms, no red flags, no one stepping in. If my parents hadn't noticed me when they did, I would have been gone in seconds, disappeared in plain sight. That thought leaves a nasty, cold feeling in my gut every time it surfaces. I survived because of timing, because of awareness, because my parents were watching closely enough, even in a place that felt safe. That's a heavy thing to carry, knowing your entire future can hinge on a moment like that. I don't live in fear now, but I don't live in ignorance either. And every time I think back to that day, to that park, to that van, I'm reminded just how thin the line can be between an ordinary childhood memory and a life that never gets the chance to exist at all. The story of that girl in Russia is one of those things that once you hear it, it never really leaves you. It doesn't matter how much time passes or how busy your life gets, because every so often it comes back without warning. A sentence, a detail, a single image slips into your mind, and suddenly your chest feels tight and your thoughts go quiet. It's not just because of how violent it was, but because of how human it was, how intimate and personal the fear became through those phone calls. It happened in a remote part of Russia, the kind of place where nature is still very much in control. Dense forests stretch for miles, villages are scattered far apart, and wild animals are not something abstract or distant. Bears are real there. They are powerful, unpredictable, and deeply respected because people know what they are capable of. This wasn't a zoo animal or a storybook creature. This was a fully grown wild bear in its own territory. The girl was young, not a child, but still very much someone who belonged with her family, someone who still called her mother when she was scared. She was out with her stepfather somewhere near the forest. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but what stays consistent is the core of what happened. They encountered a bear. It wasn't a quick attack. The bear went for the stepfather first. From what is known, he didn't survive long. There was no real chance for him once the bear decided to attack. The girl witnessed this. She saw him being killed right in front of her in a place where there was nowhere to hide and no one close enough to help. Panic took over. She ran. She did what any human would do when faced with something so terrifying and overwhelming. She ran as fast as she could, her body driven purely by fear and instinct. The forest around her wasn't made for escape. The ground was uneven, branches and roots in the way, her lungs burning as she pushed herself beyond what her body was meant to handle. She only made it about 70 meters. That's the part that feels especially cruel. 70 meters is nothing. It's the length of a short sprint, the distance between two streetlights, the space you might cross without thinking. But in that moment, it was the difference between hope and horror. The bear caught her. Somehow, through all of this, she managed to call her mother. The first call was pure terror. Her mom answered the phone, expecting a normal conversation, maybe a check-in, maybe nothing important at all. Instead, she was met with her daughter screaming, crying, barely able to form words. She was begging for help, begging her mom to come save her, begging anyone to make it stop. Her voice was shaking, breaking, filled with raw fear. At first, her mother didn't understand. How could she? Hearing your child say something impossible triggers disbelief before anything else. A bear attack sounds unreal, like something from a movie or a sick prank. Her mom thought it had to be a joke. A horrible joke, but still a joke. She tried to calm her down, to make sense of what she was hearing. Then she heard it. In the background of the call, beneath her daughter's screams and sobs, there was a sound that no human should ever have to hear while talking to their child. Deep, guttural growling, heavy breathing. The unmistakable noise of an animal that had already killed and was not done. That was the moment disbelief turned into horror. Her mother realized this was real and there was nothing she could do. She was too far away. There was no way to reach her in time. Emergency services were called, but distance and terrain work against you in places like that. Help is never just around the corner. The first call ended. The second call came later. By the time her daughter called again, the situation had changed in the worst possible way. Her voice was weaker now, quieter. The panic had drained out of it, replaced by exhaustion and pain. She was still alive, but barely. She told her mom that the bear was back. Then she said the line that has haunted so many people since. She's back now, and she brought her babies. They're eating me. There is something about that sentence that goes beyond fear. It's the casual, broken way it was said, like a child explaining something simple, even though it was anything but. Bears teaching their cubs to feed is a natural behavior, but hearing it described by a dying human being is unbearable. It strips away any emotional distance. It forces you to imagine the scene through her eyes, through her pain. Her mother was listening to this. She could hear the sounds, the movement, the growling, the chewing. The fact that she stayed on the phone at all is almost impossible to comprehend. She didn't hang up. She didn't run away from the sound. She stayed because it was her child, and this was the only connection she had left. There was nothing to say that could fix it, nothing to promise. Nothing to comfort her in any real way. The helplessness of that moment is hard to put into words. A parent's instinct is to protect, to save, to step in no matter the cost. But here, all of that instinct had nowhere to go. It had no outlet. The second call ended too. Then there was the third call. By the time it came, nearly an hour had passed since the attack began. An hour of pain, fear, and unimaginable suffering. When her mom answered this time, her daughter sounded different again. Quieter still, calm, in a way that makes your blood run cold. She said it was okay now. She said it didn't hurt anymore. That alone is devastating because it suggests her body was shutting down. That shock had taken over, dulling the pain as life slowly slipped away. She wasn't fighting anymore. She wasn't begging anymore. She told her mother to forgive her for everything. Those words say so much without explaining anything. They sound like something a child says when they believe they are about to die, when they are thinking about every small mistake, every argument, every moment they might have disappointed the person they love most. It's not logical, it's emotional, it's human. Then she said she loved her, and then the call ended. She died shortly after. Rescuers arrived about 45 minutes too late. In a situation like that, minutes matter. Distance, terrain, and response time all added up to tragedy. When they found the scene, there was nothing they could do for her. Afterward, a squad of hunters was sent into the area. They tracked down the bear and her cubs and killed them. Some people argue about that part, about nature and responsibility. But for the family, for the rescuers, for anyone who heard those phone calls, it was never really a debate. The damage was already done. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the violence. It's the phone calls, the fact that her mother didn't just lose her daughter, but heard her die, heard the fear, heard the pain, heard the moment when hope disappeared. That kind of trauma doesn't fade. It doesn't soften with time. It lives in the background forever, surfacing in quiet moments in the middle of the night, in the silence after a ringing phone. For people who hear the story secondhand, it still leaves a mark. The idea of being conscious through something like that, of having the presence of mind to call your mom, to speak, to explain what is happening to you as it happens, is deeply disturbing. It forces you to imagine yourself in that position, and once you do, you can't fully undo it. The line about the cubs eating her is especially hard to forget. It strips away any illusion of mercy. It reminds you that nature doesn't recognize innocence or fear. It doesn't pause because someone is young or loved or terrified. It simply acts. And yet, even in that horror, there is something painfully human about her final call. The forgiveness, the love, the calm acceptance. It shows how, even at the very edge of life, people reach for connection, for meaning, for the people who matter most. That's why the story lingers, not because of shock value, but because it reveals how fragile life really is, and how thin the line can be between an ordinary day and an unimaginable end. It reminds you that fear can stretch across miles through a phone call, that helplessness can be shared, and that some goodbyes are never supposed to happen the way they do. Once you hear it, you don't just remember the facts, you remember the voices, and that is what truly haunts you. My mother lived with abuse for 11 years. That is a long time to be afraid in your own home, a long time to learn how to stay quiet, how to read moods, how to survive instead of live. When I talk about my father, I don't soften it. He is a veteran and he has PTSD, but that does not excuse what he did. He also has narcissistic personality disorder, and above everything else, he is not a kind man. He never was. Whatever good moments might have existed were drowned out by fear, control, and violence. Growing up, I didn't always understand what was happening. As a kid, you normalize what you live with. You don't know that other homes are quieter, safer, calmer. You don't know that love isn't supposed to feel like walking on broken glass. My mother tried to shield us as much as she could, but abuse has a way of leaking through walls, through voices, through tension in the air. Even when nothing was happening, you could feel that something could happen at any moment. When my parents finally separated, it wasn't clean or simple. It was long, messy, and dangerous. Leaving someone like him didn't flip a switch and make things better overnight. If anything, it made him more unpredictable. He saw the separation as a loss of control, and control was everything to him. That period of time was when my mother was most afraid, even if she didn't always say it out loud. There is one night she told me about that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. It was during that long breakup period. My parents were separated, but my father was still very much a presence in our lives, whether we wanted him to be or not. That night, my mom was home alone. I was staying at my grandmother's house, and my sister was at her own father's place. For once, the house wasn't full of kids or noise or responsibility. It was just my mom and her friends. She told me she was sitting at the kitchen table with them. They were doing what they often did together, trying to create some sense of normalcy in a life that had been anything but. They were playing poker, smoking, talking, laughing a little. It was one of the few ways my mom could relax, surrounded by people who knew what she had been through and cared about her. As the night went on, the conversation drifted, as it often did, toward my father. They talked about him openly, probably more openly than my mom ever could when she was alone with him. They talked about how unstable he could be, how paranoid, how dangerous when his anger took over. They talked about things he had done in the past, things that still scared them when they thought about them. It wasn't gossip, it wasn't cruelty, it was people processing trauma together, trying to make sense of someone who had caused so much harm. What none of them knew was that he was there. At some point, my father had pulled up outside the house. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He just sat there, listening to every word, listening to people talk about him, about his violence, about his behavior. Each sentence fed his rage. Each memory shared by my mom and her friends pushed him further over the edge. He sat there long enough for the anger to build and boil. Then he burst through the back door. My mom said it happened so fast that it barely registered at first. One moment they were talking. The next moment the door flew open and he was screaming. Not shouting, not arguing, screaming in a way that made the entire room freeze. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes wild, his body moving with a purpose that made it instantly clear this was not just a confrontation. He didn't hesitate. He went straight for my mother. He grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the wall, his hands wrapped tight around her neck. He started choking her, cutting off her air, pressing his weight into her body. My mom told me she couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She could feel the wall digging into her back and his grip crushing her throat. She said she had seen him angry many times before, but never like that. This was different. This was something darker, something more dangerous. This wasn't just rage. This was loss of control combined with a sense of entitlement, like he believed he had every right to do what he was doing, like her life meant nothing in that moment. Her friends reacted instantly. If they hadn't been there, I don't think she would have survived that night. They started screaming. Someone called the police. Others physically attacked him, hitting him with whatever they could grab, pots and pans, anything heavy enough to break his focus and make him let go. It wasn't graceful or heroic. It was desperate. It was people doing whatever they could to save someone who was about to die in front of them. Eventually, the shock and the blows were enough to make him release her. My mom collapsed, gasping for air, her body shaking, her throat hurt, her voice was damaged, her mind was racing. She had just come closer to death than she ever had before, and it wasn't because of a stranger. It was because of the man she had spent 11 years with, the man who was supposed to protect her. When the police arrived, the reality of what had almost happened set in fully. My mom later told me that when she replayed the night in her head, one thought kept coming back over and over. If she had been alone, she would be dead. There is no doubt in her mind about that. No exaggeration, no drama, just a simple, horrifying fact. She said she had never seen him like that before, not even at his worst. That night showed her something about him that she hadn't fully seen, even after years of abuse. It showed her that he was capable of killing her, not accidentally, not in a moment of confusion, but deliberately, fueled by anger and wounded ego. That realization changed everything. For me, hearing this story years later was devastating in a quiet way. It didn't come with flashing images or loud reactions. It came with a slow, sick understanding of how close I came to growing up without a mother, how close my life came to breaking in a way that could never be fixed. As a child, I didn't know this story. I knew my parents fought. I knew my dad scared me sometimes. I knew my mom was tired and stressed and sad. But I didn't know how real the danger was. I didn't know that there were nights when the only thing standing between her and death was the presence of other people. Learning this as an adult reframed my entire childhood. It made sense of the fear in my mother's eyes, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way she always knew where exits were, the way she kept her phone close even when she tried to relax. These weren't quirks, they were survival habits. It also changed how I saw my father. PTSD is real. Mental illness is real. Trauma from war is real. But none of that excuses what he did. None of it makes choking someone acceptable. None of it turns abuse into something understandable or forgivable. My father made choices over and over again. Choices to control, to intimidate, to hurt. That night, he made the choice to listen outside a house, letting his anger grow instead of walking away. He made the choice to burst inside. He made the choice to wrap his hands around my mother's throat. Those choices almost killed her. What haunts me most is how ordinary the night started. A kitchen table, a card game, friends talking, cigarette smoke curling through the air. It wasn't a dangerous situation. It wasn't a confrontation. It was just people existing in what they thought was a safe space. And yet, danger was already there, sitting in a car outside, listening. That's how abuse works. It doesn't always announce itself. It watches, it waits. It looks for moments of vulnerability. It feeds on perceived disrespect and loss of control. And when it strikes, it does so with terrifying speed. My mother survived that night because she wasn't alone. That fact carries a heavy weight, because it means there were countless other nights, other moments, where the outcome could have been different, where timing or circumstance could have tipped the balance toward tragedy. She left him for good after that. Not immediately, not easily, but something in her broke and hardened at the same time. She understood, finally and fully, that staying meant risking her life. Not metaphorically, literally. For me, this story is not just about violence. It's about how close danger can be without anyone seeing it. It's about how people minimize abuse until it becomes undeniable. It's about how survivors carry memories that never fully fade, even when they move on. I think about that night sometimes and imagine the version of reality where her friends weren't there, where no one called the police, where no one swung a pan hard enough. That version of reality ends with me and my sister growing up without a mother, marked forever by a loss that should never have happened. That thought never fully leaves me. My mother is alive because of chance, because of people, because of timing. She carries scars that aren't always visible, but they are real. And when she says she had never seen him like that before, I believe her, because that night showed the truth in its rawest form. It showed that the man she had lived with for 11 years was capable of ending her life. And knowing that, really knowing it, changes the way you look at everything that came before and everything that comes after. When my little cousin was young, she had what everyone would normally call an imaginary friend. On the surface, it didn't seem strange at all. Kids do that. They invent people, talk to them, Give them names, personalities, stories. It's one of those things adults usually smile about and chalk up to creativity. That's exactly how it started, and for a long time, no one questioned it. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits. I still don't. I'm very much a logic-first kind of person, and I usually assume there's a rational explanation for things that feel creepy or unexplained. Even so, this is one of those stories that sticks with me, not because I think it proves anything supernatural, but because of how unsettling it became once you line all the details up. My cousin was very young at the time, still firmly in that stage where fantasy and reality blend together. She talked about her imaginary friend constantly, not just once in a while, but all the time. She'd mention her in passing, complain about her, laugh with her, argue with her. It wasn't background noise. This friend was part of her daily life. At first, everyone treated it like a phase. Adults would nod along when she talked about her. Sometimes they'd ask harmless questions like what her friend liked to do or where she lived. My cousin always answered confidently, like the questions were obvious. She never hesitated. She never seemed confused. It was just how things were from her point of view. What made people start to feel uneasy wasn't the existence of the imaginary friend, but how my cousin interacted with her. She didn't just talk out loud to an empty room in a playful way. She had full conversations, long ones, back and forth exchanges that sounded like two real people talking, not a child making up both sides of a game. She would pause, listen, respond. Sometimes she'd get annoyed and raise her voice, arguing with someone no one else could see. Other times she'd whisper like she didn't want anyone else to hear what was being said. One family member in particular started to feel deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't someone who was easily scared or dramatic, but the longer this went on, the more wrong it felt to them. They noticed how consistent the conversations were, how my cousin never mixed things up or contradicted herself, how she seemed genuinely reactive to what this friend supposedly said. It stopped feeling like imagination and started feeling like interaction. Still, no one wanted to jump to conclusions. Kids can be intense, kids can be weird. That's usually explanation enough. But this family member came from a very religious background, and eventually their concern crossed into fear. They didn't say anything to my cousin at first. They didn't want to scare her or suggest anything strange. Instead, they did what felt natural to them. Without my cousin knowing, they prayed. They prayed specifically about the friend. They asked for protection, and then, in their prayer, they did something very deliberate. They forbade the friend from entering the house. They spoke it out loud, firmly, as if setting a boundary. In their belief system, that kind of declaration mattered. They weren't just asking. They were telling whatever this presence was that it was not welcome. Nothing dramatic happened right away. There was no noise, no reaction, no sudden change. Time passed, and later, that same day, my cousin said something that made that family member's blood run cold. Casually, without being prompted, my cousin mentioned that her friend wouldn't come inside anymore. She said it simply, the way a child might say someone didn't want to play a certain game. When asked what she meant, she explained that her friend would stop at the door. She wouldn't come in. She would just stand there and refuse to cross the threshold. The key part was this. My cousin had no way of knowing about the prayer. No one had told her. No one had hinted. No one had suggested anything had changed. And yet, her description matched exactly what that family member had prayed for. Not loosely, not vaguely, directly. At that point, the family member was terrified. This wasn't just unease anymore. This was panic. They immediately told my cousin's parents everything about the conversations, about the prayer, about what my cousin had just said. The atmosphere in the house changed instantly. What had been brushed off as imagination suddenly felt serious. My cousin's parents didn't dismiss it. They were religious too, and even if they didn't know what to believe, they knew enough to take the situation seriously. They sat down together as a family and talked to my cousin in a calm, gentle way. They didn't accuse her. They didn't scare her. They simply explained that they were going to pray together and that they wanted everything in the house to be safe. They prayed. They asked for protection. They asked for anything that didn't belong to leave. They asked for peace. They included my cousin in the prayer, holding her hands, making sure she felt comforted, not blamed. That night passed quietly. The next day, everything was different. My cousin never mentioned her imaginary friend again. At first, the adults noticed the absence before anything else. No conversations, no arguments, no whispers. The house felt quieter in a way that was hard to describe. Eventually, someone asked my cousin about her friend, carefully, casually, like they were testing the water. She didn't know what they were talking about. She looked confused, truly confused, not like she was pretending or avoiding the topic. She had no memory of the imaginary friend at all. No name, no personality, no recollection of conversations. It was as if that entire part of her life had never existed. That more than anything else is what unsettles me. Kids forget things, sure, but they don't usually forget entire ongoing relationships overnight. They don't forget something that consumed so much of their attention and speech. This wasn't a toy she stopped playing with. This was someone she talked to daily, someone she argued with, someone who supposedly stood at the door and refused to come inside. And yet, it was gone. Completely. No sadness, no confusion about the loss, no, I miss her, just nothing. I don't know what actually happened. From a rational perspective, there are explanations. Childhood imagination can be intense and then suddenly drop off. Memory at that age is fragile. Adults may unintentionally reinforce patterns without realizing it. All of that is possible, probably even likely, but the timing is what makes it hard to ignore. The prayer, the boundary, the statement about the friend not being allowed inside anymore, the immediate disappearance, the total lack of memory, all of it lined up too cleanly, too neatly to feel comfortable. I don't believe my cousin was actually friends with a ghost, but I also can't fully shake the feeling that something strange happened, something that doesn't fit perfectly into a logical box. And maybe that discomfort comes from realizing how little we actually understand about childhood perception, imagination, and memory. Or maybe it comes from the fact that sometimes, even when you don't believe in something, the story still gets under your skin. What creeps me out the most isn't the idea of a spirit. It's the idea that my cousin experienced something so real to her that it shaped her behavior and speech for a long time, and then vanished so completely that it left no trace behind. No emotional residue, no confusion, just absence. Whether it was imagination, psychology, suggestion, or something else entirely, the experience left its mark on the adults who witnessed it. It changed how they looked at her. It changed how they thought about what kids might be aware of or sensitive to. It made them realize that just because something looks harmless on the surface doesn't mean it can't feel deeply unsettling when you really pay attention. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I get that same uncomfortable feeling in my chest. Not fear, exactly, more like a quiet awareness that there are parts of human experience we don't fully understand, especially in children, and that sometimes the scariest stories aren't about monsters or ghosts, but about moments where reality slips just enough to make you question how solid it really is. I don't believe in that kind of thing, but this is one of those stories that makes me pause before saying that too confidently. My dad used to work at a meatpacking plant in Milan, Missouri, back in the 1990s. Even by today's standards, the security at that place was intense. For the time, it was almost unreal. You didn't just walk in and start your shift. There were strict rules, procedures, layers of control that made the whole building feel more like a high-security facility than a factory. Employees weren't allowed to bring in personal belongings, no bags, no phones, no loose items. Everyone changed into uniforms on site. Everyone showered in and out. Entry points were locked down, and access required biometric scans, which felt futuristic for the 90s. Everything was designed to control contamination, prevent theft, and keep the production line running without interruption. It was clean, cold, loud, and tightly managed. My dad described the place as sterile but tense. The work was hard, repetitive, and physically demanding. People came from all kinds of backgrounds: locals, migrants, immigrants, men who had done this kind of labor their entire lives, and others who were just trying to survive and send money home. Tempers flared easily. Long shifts, sharp tools, cold air, and exhaustion created an environment where emotions stayed close to the surface, even if people tried to keep them buried. One morning, something happened that no one there ever forgot. There was an immigrant worker, a man who had been with the company for a while. He wasn't known as loud or aggressive. He showed up, did his job, didn't cause problems. Like a lot of people in that place, he kept his head down. What no one at work knew was that earlier that same morning, before he ever set foot in the plant, he had found out that another man from the same workplace was having an affair with his wife. The confrontation didn't happen at the plant. It happened at home. My dad was never told the exact details of what happened between the man and his wife that morning, only the outcome. The man murdered her. Whether it was rage, betrayal, shock, or something else snapping inside him, no one could say. What mattered was that after killing his wife, he cleaned himself up, left the house, and went to work like nothing had happened. That detail alone is hard to wrap your head around. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't spiral or break down. He went through the same security procedures as everyone else. Showered, changed, scanned in, put on his uniform, took his position on the line. He worked half his shift without incident. He cut meat. He followed instructions. He existed in the same controlled mechanical rhythm as everyone around him. No one noticed anything unusual. At some point during the shift, everyone was called into the stateroom. The stateroom was a large break or assembly area, a place where workers gathered for announcements, shift changes, or downtime. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, which was unusual for a building like that. Bright industrial light poured in, reflecting off stainless steel surfaces. The tables were heavy, cold, metallic. Everything echoed. Voices, footsteps, even breathing felt amplified in that space. There were about 75 people in the room. Men stood around talking quietly, sitting, leaning against tables. It was loud in a dull, constant way, the sound of a factory that never truly went silent. No one expected anything out of the ordinary. This was routine, mundane. The man who had murdered his wife walked into the room like everyone else. He had a razor knife with him. That wasn't unusual either. Everyone in that plant carried knives. They were tools of the job, used constantly, sharpened daily. No one thought twice about seeing one in someone's hand. Without raising his voice, without announcing himself, without any visible change in expression, he walked up behind the man who had been sleeping with his wife. Then he cut his throat. It was fast, clean, ear to ear. There was no warning, no argument, no build-up that anyone could see. 1 second, everything was normal. The next, blood was pouring down onto the steel table, bright and shocking against the cold metal. The man being attacked didn't even have time to react properly. His body slumped forward as the blade did its work. For a split second, no one moved. Shock froze the room. Then instinct kicked in. The biggest guy in the room, a massive man who towered over most of the others, grabbed a metal folding chair. Without hesitation, he swung it as hard as he could and smashed it over the attacker's head. The sound of metal hitting bone echoed through the room, sharp and violent. Nothing happened. The chair bent. The impact was brutal, but the man with the knife didn't flinch. His body didn't react. He didn't stagger. He didn't turn. It was like hitting a wall. He stayed exactly where he was, still holding the other man's head as blood continued to roll down the table and drip onto the floor. That was the moment when real fear took over. The room went completely silent, not a scream, not a shout, not even a gasp. About 75 people stood there, frozen, watching something that didn't feel real. For roughly 10 seconds, no one moved. The attacker stood there calmly, knife still in his hand, his grip steady, his posture relaxed, as if he had just finished an ordinary task. He slowly looked up. He made eye contact with the man who had hit him with the chair. That look is what people remembered most. Not rage, not madness, just a flat, empty awareness. A look that said he was done, that whatever had needed to happen had already happened. There was nothing left to fight for or run from. That was when everyone ran. All 75 people cleared that room in under 6 seconds. My dad said it was like a switch flipped. Chairs overturned. Boots slammed against the floor. Bodies collided in the rush for the exits. No one helped anyone else. No one looked back. Survival instinct took over completely. People poured out of the room, down hallways, through doors, desperate to put distance between themselves and what they had just witnessed. The attacker didn't chase anyone. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't move. He sat down. He placed the knife on the table and waited for the police to arrive. When law enforcement came, he went with them without resistance. Later, when people tried to process what they had seen, the details became even more disturbing. The man had known exactly what he was going to do. He had already crossed whatever line separates hesitation from action earlier that day. By the time he walked into that stateroom, there was nothing left inside him to restrain. No fear of consequences, no concern for witnesses, no emotional reaction to violence. He had already destroyed his own life that morning. Everything after that was just completion. My dad said the plant was never the same after that. The security didn't change much because there wasn't much more they could add. What changed was the atmosphere. People were quieter, more guarded. Conversations dropped off. No one joked the same way. Everyone became more aware of how little they really knew about the people they worked next to every day. The idea that someone could commit a murder, then show up to work and function normally for hours, shattered a lot of assumptions. It forced people to confront how invisible rage can be, how betrayal and obsession can build silently, how violence doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. What unsettled my dad the most wasn't the blood or the attack itself. It was the moment the chair did nothing. That instant stripped away the illusion of control. The biggest, strongest guy in the room had done exactly what you'd expect someone to do in that situation, and it didn't matter at all. The attacker wasn't unstoppable because he was physically invincible. He was unstoppable because he was already beyond fear. Pain didn't register. Consequences didn't matter. His body was just carrying out something his mind had already finished. In the years after, people told and retold the story, sometimes with small details changing, but the core always stayed the same. The calmness, the precision, the silence. The way the man sat down afterward like his shift had simply ended. For my dad, it became one of those memories that never fades. Not something that haunted him every day, but something that reshaped how he looked at people. He became more cautious, more observant. He stopped assuming that anger always looks loud or obvious. He understood that some of the most dangerous moments come from people who seem completely normal until the second they aren't. The story spread through town, through families, through generations. People who weren't even alive when it happened know about it now. It became part of the plant's dark history, a reminder of how quickly order can collapse, even in a place built entirely around control. What makes it so disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the restraint. The way everything happened without chaos until after it was already too late. The way the man waited, the way he accepted the end. The way 75 people realized at the same time that they were standing in a room with someone who had nothing left to lose. That kind of moment stays with you because it forces you to accept a truth most people don't like to think about. That sometimes the scariest people aren't the ones who look angry or unstable. Sometimes they're the ones who have already made peace with what they're about to do, long before anyone else realizes there's danger at all. In 1988, I was a brand new mother who had just returned to work, still trying to figure out how to exist in a world that suddenly felt completely different. Motherhood rewires you in ways you don't expect. Your body is exhausted, your emotions are raw, and your sense of responsibility is overwhelming. Every sound feels louder, every night feels heavier. Sleep comes in thin, fragile stretches, and when it does, it never feels deep enough. My husband worked second shift back then, which meant I was often alone in the evenings and at night. We lived in the country, far enough away from town that the nights were truly dark. No streetlights, no steady traffic noise, just the hum of insects, the wind through the trees, and the occasional car passing by on the road. It was quiet in a way that could be peaceful, but also isolating. I wasn't completely alone, though. We had two large black Labradors. They weren't trained guard dogs in any official sense, but they were protective, alert, and deeply bonded to us. They were the kind of dogs who noticed everything: a raccoon in the yard, a strange noise in the distance, a car slowing down near the house. They had never given me a reason to doubt their instincts. That night, it was dark outside, the kind of dark where the world feels closed in. I had finally fallen asleep after one of those long, exhausting days that only new parents truly understand. My body had barely relaxed when the dogs exploded into barking. It wasn't their usual bark. It was frantic, aggressive, relentless. They were losing their minds in a way I had never heard before. Growling, barking, pacing, throwing themselves at the door. It snapped me awake instantly, heart pounding, adrenaline flooding my system before I even had time to think. At first, I thought maybe an animal had wandered too close to the house. That happened sometimes. But the intensity of their reaction didn't fit. This wasn't curiosity or territorial warning. This was alarm. I got out of bed and went to the front door, trying to calm them down, telling them it was okay. They didn't listen. They wouldn't stop. Finally, I opened the door and let them out, hoping they'd chase off whatever was bothering them and settle down. As soon as the door opened, they charged into the darkness. That's when I noticed the car. It was stopped on the road directly in front of my house. I remember pausing for a second, standing there in my night clothes, the cool night air hitting my skin. The car wasn't parked in the driveway or pulled off to the side. It was stopped at the stop sign that sat near our house. That wasn't unusual. We lived by a stop sign, and people occasionally slowed down or stopped longer than necessary, trying to figure out where they were or which direction they needed to go. I watched the car for a moment. Then, as soon as the dogs ran out barking, it sped off. Fast, not a slow roll forward, not a casual pull away. It took off down the road like the driver wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. That caught my attention, but not enough to trigger panic. At the time, it still didn't feel like a big deal. People get spooked by big dogs, especially at night. I remember thinking they probably didn't expect two large black shapes to come charging out of the darkness. The dogs ran a short distance and then came back, still agitated but settling down. I called them inside, shut the door, and locked it. My heart slowed. The house felt quiet again. I told myself everything was fine. I went back to bed, and life went on. A few days later, I left for work like any other morning. The sun was up. The world looked normal. Birds chirped. The road was quiet. Nothing felt off until I noticed a sheriff's car parked near my house. At first, I thought maybe they were dealing with a traffic issue, or someone had broken down nearby. Living in the country, you see police vehicles parked in odd places from time to time, but something about it made my stomach tighten. Later that day, the truth came out. A local restaurant manager had kidnapped a young girl, not far away, not in some distant town, right there, on that same stretch of road. The details came in pieces, each one heavier than the last. He had abducted her earlier, and at some point, while driving, she tried to escape. When he slowed down at the stop sign in front of my house, she saw her chance. She tried to run. That was where he killed her, in front of my house. They found her purse and one of her shoes in the ditch, along the road, right where the dogs had been barking, right where that car had been stopped, right where I had stood in the doorway, watching. When I heard that, the world tilted. Everything rushed back at once. The dogs losing their minds. The car stopped in front of the house. The way it sped off the second the door opened, and the dogs came charging out. Suddenly, those moments weren't harmless or ordinary anymore. They were part of something horrifying. I replayed that night over and over in my head. What if I had woken up faster? What if I had gone outside immediately instead of hesitating? What if I had turned on the lights? What if I had screamed? What if I had called the police right then? What if I had seen her? What if I could have helped her? Those questions became a loop I couldn't escape. I kept imagining her there in the dark, terrified, desperate enough to try to run. I imagined how close she was to safety without knowing it, how close she was to someone who might have been able to help, even if just by making noise, by being seen, by interrupting what was happening. The guilt settled in slowly, but deeply. I know logically that I didn't know what was happening. I know that I had no reason to assume the worst. I know that I was a tired new mother, alone at night, doing what felt safe and reasonable. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. It whispers. It tells you that if you had done one thing differently, someone else might still be alive. The man confessed. There was no mystery about his guilt. No doubt. He admitted to what he had done. Eventually, he was executed for his crimes. Some people found comfort in that. Justice, they called it. Closure. For me, it didn't erase the feeling. Afterward, investigators began looking into his past more closely. That's when another chilling possibility emerged. They believed he may have been responsible for the death of his wife several years earlier. At the time, her death hadn't been clearly labeled as murder. But with what they now knew about him, with his confession and the pattern of violence, it took on a new meaning. The idea that he had lived among people, worked a normal job, managed a restaurant, smiled at customers, all while carrying that capacity for violence, made my skin crawl. It made me question how well we ever really know the people around us. What haunted me most was how ordinary everything had seemed. That night didn't feel like a scene from a crime story. It felt like a normal interruption. Dogs barking, a car at a stop sign, a moment of alertness that faded just as quickly as it came. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. And yet someone was dying just yards away. For a long time after that, I struggled with sleep. Every bark from the dog sent my heart racing. Every car slowing down on the road made me tense. I started turning on lights more often, checking windows, listening harder. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially at night. Motherhood amplified everything. I would look at my child and feel a wave of fear crash over me. Fear of how fragile life is. Fear of how quickly everything can change. Fear of the fact that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips through quietly, disguised as normalcy. The dogs never barked like that again. That fact alone stays with me. They sensed something that night, something wrong enough to make them react in a way they never had before. They knew in the way animals sometimes seem to know things we don't. They tried to warn me. They tried to intervene in the only way they could. And maybe they did. I don't know if their barking scared him enough to make him leave faster. I don't know if those few seconds mattered at all. I don't know if anything could have changed the outcome once he decided to act. But I hold on to the idea that the dogs did something, even if it was small. Still, the regret remains. Not loud, not constant, but present. Every so often it surfaces when I drive past that spot. When I hear about another missing girl. When I see a car idling too long at an intersection at night. When I remember how close danger can be without anyone realizing it. I think about her often, even though I never knew her name personally. I think about how scared she must have been, how brave she was to try to run, how unfair it was that her life ended there, in the dark, on a quiet country road. I think about how many moments in life pass us by without meaning, and how some moments carry weight we don't recognize until it's too late. That night taught me something I've never forgotten. Evil doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes it stops at a sign, waits quietly, and disappears into the dark before anyone understands what they're seeing. And sometimes the hardest thing to live with isn't what you did wrong, but what you didn't know you needed to do at all. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. I never really celebrated my birthday growing up. It always landed in early August, right at the worst possible time if you were a kid hoping for friends to show up. It was either the last week of summer break or the last couple of days before school started again. Families were on vacation, kids were out of town, or everyone was already mentally checked out and dreading the return to school. Every year, it felt like bad timing stacked on top of bad timing. I remember asking for birthday parties when I was younger and watching my parents try to make it work, sending out invitations, planning food, cleaning the house. And then the day would come, and maybe one kid would show up. Sometimes none. Meanwhile, my brothers would have birthdays during the school year and the house would be packed. Balloons everywhere. Noise. Kids running around. Gifts piled on the table. I would sit there and feel something I didn't have words for yet. Something between jealousy and embarrassment and quiet sadness. After a while, I stopped asking. I told myself it didn't matter. I pretended I didn't care. I learned how to shrink that expectation until it disappeared entirely. By the time I was a teenager, my birthday felt more like an inconvenience than something worth acknowledging. It was just another day that reminded me of being overlooked, of bad timing, of not fitting neatly into moments that were supposed to feel special. That feeling followed me into adulthood. Even when I had friends, even when celebrating would have been easy, I avoided it. If someone asked what I wanted to do for my birthday, I'd brush it off. I'd say I didn't care. I'd say I wasn't really into birthdays. It was easier than admitting that the idea still carried that old weight, that familiar disappointment. It was easier than risking that same hollow feeling all over again. So most years my birthday came and went quietly. This year was different. I don't even know why. There wasn't a big reason or a dramatic shift. My friends just kept pushing the idea. They said we should go out. They said it didn't have to be a big deal. Just dinner, maybe some drinks. Something simple. Normally, I would have said no without thinking twice. I'd done it 100 times before. But this time, I hesitated, and then I said it. Fuck it, let's go. The words surprised me as much as anyone else. It felt like a small rebellion against my own habits, against years of keeping that day emotionally locked away. I told myself it was just dinner, just drinks. Nothing to overthink. We decided to go to Texas Roadhouse first. It was loud, busy, exactly what you'd expect. The smell of grilled meat hit you as soon as you walked in. Country music playing softly in the background, people laughing, servers weaving between tables with baskets of rolls and trays of drinks. It felt normal, comforting even. We ordered food and then drinks, and then more drinks. I ended up eating way too much. Steak, sides, bread. I drank more than I usually would too. Strong margaritas that didn't taste strong until you stood up. By the time we were done, we were full, tired, and pleasantly dulled. That kind of exhaustion where the idea of changing clothes and going somewhere else feels like too much effort. We had talked earlier about going out afterward, the Oregon District bars, the usual weekend spot. It was the place we spent most weekends, the place we knew well. It felt familiar, safe, routine. But sitting there at the table, none of us wanted to move. Someone said they were too full. Someone else said they were tired. Another person laughed and said they'd rather just go home and pass out. One by one, the plan quietly died. No argument, no disappointment, just a collective agreement that the night had already been enough. So we paid the bill, hugged in the parking lot, and went our separate ways. I went home, kicked off my shoes, and fell asleep without thinking much about it. In my mind, it had been a good night. Not exciting, not dramatic, just good. Food, friends, laughter. A birthday that didn't hurt. At around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The room felt strange, like something had pulled me out of sleep abruptly. The TV was on, low volume, something I must have left playing without realizing it. I was still half asleep when the words started to register. Mass shooting in the Oregon District. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. My brain tried to reject it, to shove it back into sleep where things didn't make sense and didn't matter. I blinked a few times, staring at the screen, my heart starting to beat faster. The words didn't go away. They sharpened. Then it hit me. The Oregon District. The place we had planned to go, the place we spent our weekends. The place that felt like home in a casual, social way. The place that was only a couple miles from where I lived. I sat up in bed. The news anchor's voice was steady, professional, almost detached. Details started coming in. Shots fired. Multiple victims, chaos, police response. My stomach dropped as the reality settled in. This wasn't some far-off place. This wasn't something happening somewhere else to other people. This was my area. This was where we were supposed to be. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking slightly as I checked messages. Group chats were already lighting up. Everyone was awake now. Everyone was asking the same questions. Are you okay? Did you hear? Holy shit. We were supposed to be there. I lay back against the headboard, staring at the wall as the weight of it all pressed down on me. If we hadn't gone to dinner, if we hadn't eaten too much, if we hadn't had those drinks, if one person hadn't said they were tired, if I had said no to dinner and yes to going out like usual, if everything had gone the way it normally did, we would have been there. That realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, as my mind replayed the night over and over again. I could picture us walking down those streets, standing in lines, laughing, checking our phones. existing in that space without a second thought. I kept thinking about how ordinary the reasons were that kept us away. A couple ounces of steak, a few strong margaritas, full stomachs, laziness, comfort, nothing heroic, nothing intentional, just chance. That's the part that messes with me the most. It wasn't a decision to stay safe. It wasn't a gut feeling or a warning or some deep intuition. It was just life unfolding in a slightly different direction. The kind of direction that usually doesn't matter at all until suddenly it matters more than anything. I watched the coverage until I couldn't anymore. Names hadn't been released yet, faces blurred, sirens flashing, crowds gathered behind police tape. I recognized the streets, the buildings, the places where I'd laughed, where I'd celebrated other people's birthdays, where I'd spent ordinary nights without ever thinking they could turn into something like this. Eventually, I turned the TV off. The room felt too quiet after that. My thoughts were too loud. I didn't sleep much for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined alternate versions of the evening. Versions where we went out anyway. Versions where I woke up to messages asking if I was alive instead of safe at home in my bed. In the days that followed, the feeling didn't go away. People checked in. Friends talked about it. Social media filled with tributes, anger, fear, arguments, grief. Life moved forward the way it always does after something terrible happens. But I felt stuck in that moment, stuck in the realization of how close we came without ever knowing it. I started waking up every day with a strange heaviness. Not fear exactly, not guilt in the traditional sense, something quieter and harder to define. A sense of being slightly out of place in my own life, like I had stepped sideways out of a different future and didn't know what to do with that knowledge. I thought about birthdays differently after that. I thought about how close I came to never having another one. How a day I had spent most of my life avoiding had ended up being the reason I was alive. There's a strange irony in that, one that doesn't feel funny at all. A day that had always carried sadness and disappointment ended up carrying something else entirely. I didn't feel grateful in the way people expect you to feel. I felt unsettled. Gratitude implies a sense of purpose, like something happened for a reason. This didn't feel like that. This felt random and unfair. For every person who stayed home because they were tired or full, there were others who didn't. For every life that continued, there were lives that ended for no reason at all. I think about them a lot. I think about the people who went out that night expecting nothing more than a normal weekend. People who were laughing, checking their phones, ordering drinks, making plans for the next day. People who didn't know their lives were about to end or change forever. And then I think about how close I was to being among them. It's a strange thing to carry. It doesn't make me feel special or lucky in a comforting way. It makes me feel fragile, aware. It reminds me that the line between before and after can be as thin as a dinner decision, as insignificant as being too full to walk another block. I don't celebrate my birthday now either, but I think about it differently. It no longer feels like a reminder of being forgotten. It feels like a quiet marker, a line in my life where everything could have stopped and didn't. I don't make a big deal out of it. I don't throw parties. I don't post about it. I just notice it. Every year when it comes around, I remember that night. I remember waking up to the news. I remember the way my heart sank when I realized where it had happened. I remember the cold, hollow feeling that followed, and I carry it with me. Not as fear, but as awareness, because now I know in a way I didn't before that sometimes survival has nothing to do with strength or intelligence or preparation. Sometimes it's just steak and margaritas. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's someone saying, "I'm good, let's just go home." And sometimes you wake up the next day feeling off, not because something happened to you, but because something almost did. That feeling doesn't go away easily. It lingers in the background of your life, a quiet reminder that there are countless versions of any given night, and you only ever experience one of them. My auntie's story is one of those things that stays with you no matter how much time passes. It isn't loud or dramatic in the way people expect tragedy to be. There are no warning signs that line up neatly, no moment where you can point and say, "That's when everything went wrong." It starts quietly, in a normal house, on a normal night, with nothing that feels unusual until it's already far too late. She was downstairs watching television that evening, just sitting there, trying to unwind the way people do at the end of the day. The house was calm. Everyone else was in bed. The lights were low, and the only real sound was whatever was playing on the TV and the faint, familiar noises of a house settling, the kind of night that blends into every other night and leaves no mark on your memory. Then she heard a noise upstairs. At first, it barely registered. Houses make sounds. Floorboards creak, pipes shift, kids move around in their sleep. Especially at night, when everything else is quiet, even the smallest noise can seem louder than it really is. She didn't jump up right away or feel alarmed. She assumed it was nothing. But then it happened again. And again. Not loud, but consistent enough to be noticed. Something about it caught her attention in a way that made it hard to ignore. She muted the TV and listened. The noise came from upstairs, somewhere near the staircase. It wasn't crashing or banging, just a repeated sound that didn't fit neatly into the usual category of nighttime house noises. Still, she didn't panic. She didn't assume the worst. She was a mother, and like most parents, her first instinct was that one of the kids was out of bed when they shouldn't be. Maybe he'd gotten up for water. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he was messing around when he was supposed to be in bed. So she got up to check. She walked toward the staircase, calling his name casually, already forming the words she'd use to tell him off for being up so late. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked up, expecting to see movement or maybe to hear him respond. That's when she saw him. He was standing at the top of the stairs. From where she was, she could only just make him out in the dim light. The moonlight from upstairs filtered into the hallway, outlining his shape. He was completely still, facing down toward her, just standing there on the top step. For a moment, it looked exactly like what she had expected to see. A child caught out of bed, a kid frozen in place because they'd been spotted. It's such a familiar image that her brain didn't question it right away. She told him off. She told him to get back into bed. She spoke in that automatic, half-annoyed, half-tired parent voice, already ready to turn around and go back downstairs once he obeyed. He didn't move. She frowned, slightly irritated now, and told him again. Still no response. He didn't speak. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't react at all. That was when she started to think maybe he was sleepwalking. It would explain the silence, the blank stillness, the way he didn't answer her. Sleepwalking is strange, but not unheard of, and in that moment it was still a comforting explanation. Something odd, but not dangerous. She started walking up the stairs toward him. As she climbed, she kept talking, telling him to wake up, telling him to go back to bed, trying to get some kind of reaction. The closer she got, the more wrong it felt. He didn't sway or shift the way someone normally would when standing. He didn't respond to her voice at all. He just stood there, motionless, his outline sharp in the moonlight. Halfway up, something caught her eye. There was a cord. At first, her mind didn't understand what she was seeing. The cord seemed to disappear behind his head, blending into the darkness. It didn't make sense in the context her brain was still clinging to. She kept climbing, each step bringing clarity she didn't want. When she reached the top of the stairs, the truth hit her all at once. His feet weren't on the carpet. They were just barely above it. Only a few millimeters. So close that from the bottom of the stairs, it had looked like he was standing normally. The angle, the lighting, the way the upstairs hallway wrapped around the staircase, all of it had combined to create a horrific illusion. He hadn't been standing there. He had been hanging. He had managed it in such a way that his body appeared upright, still, almost peaceful at a glance. The cord was secured above him, hidden in the darkness behind his head. The moonlight had outlined his form just enough to make it look like a child standing silently at the top of the stairs. By the time she reached him, it was already too late. She touched him and immediately knew. His skin was cold. Not cool, not chilled, but cold in a way that told her life had already left his body. The warmth she expected wasn't there. There was no response, no movement, no breath. That moment shattered her. There are no words that really capture what it must be like to realize in an instant that the person you were just telling off for being out of bed is gone. That the noise you heard wasn't mischief or restlessness, but the final movements of a life ending just a few feet above you. The house, which had felt ordinary moments before, became a nightmare. Everything after that blurs together in fragments. Screaming, calling for help, panic, shock, the kind of chaos that erupts when something happens that the human mind isn't equipped to process. The kind of trauma that brands itself onto every memory connected to that place, that staircase, that light. She said later that what haunted her most wasn't just the sight of him, but the seconds before she understood. The moment where she was annoyed instead of afraid. The way she spoke to him as if he were just another tired kid breaking the rules. That realization stayed with her, replaying over and over even though she had done nothing wrong. The family was destroyed by it. That isn't an exaggeration or a dramatic way of speaking. It didn't just hurt them. It broke them in ways they never fully recovered from. Grief like that doesn't come with a clean timeline. It doesn't fade neatly. It spreads, seeps into everything, reshapes relationships, identities, and futures. His father never recovered. A few months later, after watching his family collapse under the weight of what had happened, he jumped out of a window and took his own life. The pain didn't just claim one person. It echoed. It multiplied. It tore through everyone connected to them. 2 lives lost, bound together by grief. The rest of the family carried on because they had no choice, but nothing was the same. The house never felt like a home again. The staircase became something else entirely, a place no one wanted to look at for too long. Silence became heavier. Laughter felt wrong. Holidays became unbearable reminders of who was missing. What made it even harder was how close-knit they had been before. This wasn't a family already fractured by distance or resentment. They were close. They spent time together. They showed up for each other. From the outside, they looked like one of those families people envy, the kind that feels solid and safe and permanent, and then they weren't. I think part of what makes this story so chilling is how easily it could have happened in any house. There was no locked room, no dramatic setup, just a staircase, a hallway, and a trick of light that turned a final act into something that looked, for a few terrible seconds, like a child standing quietly in the moonlight. When I picture it, it sends a cold wave through me every time. The image is burned into my mind even though I wasn't there. A small figure at the top of the stairs, still, silent, watching. The kind of image that belongs in nightmares, not in real life. It didn't just take 2 people. It changed everyone connected to them. Even those of us who weren't blood relatives felt the ripple effects. We were close enough to feel the shock and the sadness, but distant enough to survive it without being pulled completely under. Sometimes I think that separation is the only reason Some of us were able to move forward at all, not untouched, but not destroyed. There's guilt in that too, in a strange way, a sense of having escaped something purely by circumstance. Stories like this strip away the comforting idea that tragedy announces itself, that there are clear signs, that you'll know when something is wrong. Sometimes it doesn't come screaming or crashing. Sometimes it sounds like a small noise upstairs. Sometimes it looks like a child standing still in the moonlight. And sometimes by the time you understand what you're really seeing, it's already over. That's what makes it so brutal. Not just the loss, but the quiet, ordinary way it entered their lives and tore everything apart. It happened in 2008 on a Greyhound bus traveling through rural Manitoba. The bus was headed west, cutting through long stretches of open road where there is nothing but fields, sky, and the sense that you are far from help. These routes are quiet. People sleep, listen to music, stare out windows, or just try to pass the time. There's a strange intimacy to long-distance buses. You're surrounded by strangers, but you trust the shared understanding that everyone just wants to get home safely. Tim McLean was one of those passengers. He was young, only in his early 20s, and he was on his way home. Like many people on long rides, he had fallen asleep in his seat. There was nothing unusual about him, nothing that marked him out. He wasn't arguing with anyone, wasn't drinking, wasn't causing trouble. He was just sleeping, unaware that his life was about to end in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Sitting nearby was another passenger, a man named Vincent Lee. To the people around him, he appeared quiet, withdrawn, and odd in a way that didn't immediately raise alarms. On buses, especially long ones, you see all kinds of people. Silence isn't suspicious. Keeping to yourself isn't unusual. No one had a reason to think that anything was about to happen. Without warning, Lee stood up. There was no shouting, no argument, no visible trigger that anyone could point to afterward. He simply took out a large knife and began stabbing Tim McLean as he slept. The attack was sudden and violent, and it took a few seconds for the other passengers to even understand what they were seeing. At first, some thought it was a fight or a medical emergency, or something they couldn't quite process yet. Then the screaming started. People realized immediately that this was not something they could stop. There was no security on the bus, no barrier, no way to intervene safely. Panic took over, the kind that spreads instantly and leaves no room for reasoned thought. Passengers rushed toward the front of the bus, toward the exit, desperate to get away from what was unfolding behind them. The driver stopped the bus. People poured out onto the roadside, some barefoot, some crying, some in shock. In the chaos, they managed to barricade the door from the outside, trapping Lee inside the bus. It was a desperate, instinctive move, fueled by fear and the hope that at least they could prevent him from reaching anyone else. They waited outside. That detail is one of the most disturbing parts of the story. The passengers didn't escape and immediately find safety or relief. They were stuck there, standing on the side of a dark rural road, watching through the bus windows as something unspeakable continued inside. They could hear noises, they could see movement. They knew Tim was already gone, but what they witnessed next went beyond anything most people could imagine. Lee decapitated Tim McLean. He then carried the severed head to the front of the bus, holding it up where it was clearly visible to the passengers waiting outside. He began eating pieces of Tim's flesh, calmly, deliberately, in full view of dozens of horrified people who could do nothing but watch. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. It wasn't frantic or chaotic. Witnesses later described it as disturbingly calm. Lee moved around the bus as if he were alone, as if the people outside weren't there, as if what he was doing made perfect sense to him. The passengers outside were screaming, crying, calling the police, trying to comfort each other while being forced to look at something that would live in their memories forever. Some of them vomited, some collapsed, some stood frozen, unable to move, their brains unable to reconcile what their eyes were seeing. Police eventually arrived and arrested Lee without resistance. When they entered the bus, the scene was beyond comprehension. The investigation later revealed that the victim's eyes and part of his heart were never recovered and were presumed to have been eaten. That sentence alone is enough to make most people feel sick. It strips away any emotional distance you might try to maintain. It makes the crime feel intimate in the worst possible way. In the aftermath, the country was in shock. This wasn't a murder that happened in a dark alley or behind closed doors. It happened in a shared space on public transportation to a random sleeping passenger. It shattered the illusion that you are safe simply because you are surrounded by others. It forced people to confront the reality that extreme violence can erupt anywhere, without warning and without reason that makes sense to those watching. As horrifying as the crime itself was, what followed disturbed many people almost as much. Lee was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. At the time of the attack, he was experiencing a psychotic episode. He believed he was under threat from forces that did not exist. In his mind, he was not murdering an innocent person. He was acting under delusions that completely detached him from reality. Because of this, he was found not criminally responsible. For many people, that phrase felt like a slap in the face. Not criminally responsible. It sounded like a technicality, like a way to soften something that could never be softened. Tim McLean was dead. His family was destroyed. Dozens of witnesses were traumatized for life. And yet the man who did it was not being treated like a murderer in the traditional sense. Lee was committed to a psychiatric hospital. At first, that felt appropriate to some. He was clearly mentally ill. He needed treatment, not punishment. But as the years passed, public unease grew. Reviews were conducted. Privileges were granted. Restrictions were eased. He was allowed supervised outings, then unsupervised ones. Eventually, his name was changed, and he was granted full release. 9 years after the attack, Vincent Lee was a free man. That fact alone is enough to make many people feel physically ill. To the public, it felt impossibly fast. 9 years for an act so extreme that it had become infamous worldwide. 9 years after a crime that had permanently scarred everyone who witnessed it and everyone who loved the victim. The idea that someone who had committed such an act could walk free again was something many people simply could not accept. Tim McLean's family spoke out about their pain, their anger, and their sense of betrayal by the system. They weren't denying that mental illness played a role. They weren't asking for cruelty. They were asking how anyone could feel safe knowing that the man who killed their son in such a horrific way was back in the world. That question still hangs in the air. The case forces people into uncomfortable territory. On one side, there is the reality of severe mental illness, the understanding that people in psychosis are not operating with free will in the way society normally defines it. On the other side, there is the undeniable harm done, the irreversible loss, and the fear that something like this could happen again. There is no answer that satisfies everyone. For the passengers who were on that bus, life was never the same. Many suffered from severe post-traumatic stress. Some couldn't ride buses anymore. Some struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and intrusive memories. They didn't just witness violence. They were forced into prolonged exposure, trapped outside, watching through glass as the unthinkable continued. For them, the crime didn't end when the police arrived. It followed them home. It followed them into sleep. It followed them into ordinary moments, appearing without warning in flashes of memory. For Tim McLean's family, time did not heal the wound. It only changed its shape. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones became reminders of what was stolen. The public attention faded, but their grief didn't. Knowing how their son died, knowing how public and brutal it was, is a burden no parent should ever have to carry. What makes this case especially haunting is how random it was. Tim didn't know Lee. There was no connection, no history, no reason. He was simply in the wrong seat at the wrong time. That randomness is terrifying because it means there is nothing to learn that would have prevented it. No warning signs for the victim. No choices he could have made differently. It also exposed a harsh truth about public safety. On that bus, everyone was vulnerable. There was no escape plan, no defense, no protection. The only thing that stopped Lee from harming more people was the collective instinct of the passengers to barricade him inside. Even that came at a cost, forcing them to witness something no human should have to see. Years later, the story is still told and retold, not because people enjoy the horror, but because it represents something deeply unsettling about the world. It sits at the intersection of mental illness, violence, justice, and randomness in a way that refuses to resolve cleanly. When people learn that Lee was released after 9 years, the reaction is almost always disbelief. It feels like a failure of balance, like compassion for one person came at the expense of safety and dignity for everyone else involved. Others argue that indefinite punishment for someone who was profoundly psychotic at the time of the crime would be equally unjust. Both positions carry weight, but for many, the emotional truth is simpler. A young man went to sleep on a bus and never woke up. His death was horrific, public, and senseless, and the person who did it is now living a life that Tim never got the chance to live. That contrast is hard to reconcile. The Greyhound bus attack remains one of the most disturbing crimes in modern Canadian history, not just because of what happened, but because of what it forces us to confront. That safety is fragile. That mental illness can manifest in terrifying ways, that justice is not always emotionally satisfying, and that sometimes there is no outcome that feels fair. Once you know this story, it changes the way you look at shared spaces, at strangers, at the thin, invisible line that separates normalcy from catastrophe. It reminds you that horror doesn't always come with warning signs, and that sometimes survival and death are separated by nothing more than chance. That's why it stays with people. Not because of shock value alone, but because it exposes how vulnerable we all really are and how little control we sometimes have over the moments that define our lives. What unsettles me most about this isn't just the brutality itself, but how comfortably history seems to rearrange it when it becomes inconvenient. The Iron Guard of Romania were not abstract extremists or misunderstood radicals. They were fanatical fascists whose violence was intimate, theatrical, and deliberately sadistic. During the Bucharest pogrom, their crimes went far beyond murder. Jews were not only killed, they were humiliated, tortured, and desecrated in ways that feel almost impossible to process even now. People were hanged from meat hooks in butcher shops. Bodies were mutilated. Children were raped while dying. These weren't battlefield atrocities committed in the fog of war. They were ritualized acts of hatred meant to terrorize, dehumanize, and send a message. That alone should place the Iron Guard permanently beyond rehabilitation in the moral record. And yet, history did something grotesque with them. After the war, when Romania fell under communist control, many former Iron Guard members were not simply punished and erased. Instead, a number of them were quietly absorbed into the new system. They were recruited, consulted, and employed by the communist secret police, the Securitate. Men who had participated in fascist mass murder were suddenly useful again. Their fanaticism, their experience with repression, their willingness to brutalize enemies without hesitation, these traits didn't disappear when the ideology changed. They were repurposed. The uniform changed. The slogans changed. The cruelty didn't. What makes this especially disturbing is that the transition wasn't even particularly contradictory. Totalitarian systems often recognize each other's value. A man who knows how to terrorize civilians, extract obedience, and erase empathy doesn't stop being useful just because the flag above him is replaced. The Iron Guard's violent absolutism fit uncomfortably well inside a communist security apparatus that demanded unquestioning loyalty and moral numbness. So the same people who had butchered Jews in the name of fascism were now advising, training, or working for a regime that claimed to be anti-fascist. And then comes the part that feels almost surreal. In modern Romania, there are monuments and memorials that still honor some of these figures as anti-communist heroes. Their fascism is minimized. Their crimes are blurred. Their victims are quietly removed from the story. What remains is a sanitized narrative in which opposition to communism is treated as a moral absolution, strong enough to wash away anything that came before. Anti-communist they may have been, but heroes. That's where the whole thing collapses. Opposition to one evil does not redeem participation in another. Being against communism does not erase the fact that these men raped children, mutilated corpses, and turned murder into spectacle. There is something profoundly broken in a historical memory that can look at that record and decide it is compatible with honor. What bothers me most is not that history is complicated. I can accept complexity. I can accept moral ambiguity. I can even accept that people exist who are neither fully villain nor fully victim. But the Iron Guard were not morally ambiguous actors caught in impossible circumstances. They were ideologues who embraced cruelty as virtue. Their violence was not incidental. It was the point. Calling them madmen almost feels too generous because madness implies loss of control or detachment from reality. What they did was intentional, organized, and justified within their worldview. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they believed it was righteous. The fact that later regimes found them useful doesn't make them tragic figures. It makes them a case study in how systems of power recycle human brutality when it serves their ends. Fascism didn't disappear, it metastasized. Communism didn't purge it, it absorbed it. And modern memorialization completes the cycle by laundering it. I find it especially disturbing because it exposes how selective moral memory can be. In some contexts, historical crimes are treated as unforgivable, defining forever the legacy of those who committed them. In others, those same crimes are quietly pushed aside because the perpetrators can be reframed as useful symbols in a different ideological struggle. The victims don't get monuments. The raped children don't get statues. The people hanged on meat hooks don't get their names carved into stone. Instead, the men who helped create that horror are remembered for the one thing that makes them politically convenient decades later. I wouldn't call my own worldview particularly sentimental or moralistic either. I don't need history to be comforting. I don't need heroes to be pure. But there has to be a line somewhere, a point beyond which no amount of political utility or ideological alignment can redeem a person's actions. For me, that line is crossed when cruelty becomes ritual, when violence is sexualized, when children are targeted, and when murder is turned into theater. If those acts don't permanently disqualify someone from honor, then the word honor has lost all meaning. What this history really shows is not just the horror of the Iron Guard, but the danger of treating ideology as a moral solvent. Once you decide that being against the right enemy is enough, You open the door to rehabilitating anyone, no matter how monstrous, as long as they can be pointed in the correct direction. And that, more than anything, is what makes this legacy so unsettling. Not just that these men existed, but that we are still, even now, finding ways to excuse them. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.